we have discovered that Russia is not a great power. Its economy ranks behind South Korea's. It is a weak economy. Its military has shown itself to be incapable of adequate planning or the execution of a war, even if it's at a country as weak as Ukraine. So our vision of what Russia was already damaged in 1991, that vision is now doubled down. And whatever the Russians say, we know they couldn't take Kiev. We know that they couldn't take Ukraine. We know that they couldn't survive the sanctions without stumbling. And a third element emerged, which I was surprised by: the reemergence of American power. Power not military, but economic. The power of the dollar, when it was denied to the Russians, when that denial was joined by the Europeans, when it was joined by Japan, by a worldwide coalition, crushed, I would say, Russia's capability to make war. Those wars are expensive. In addition to that, the United States discovered that it was a leader of coalitions, of NATO, of course, China as well, of Australia, so on and so forth. That when the war came there, the United States discovered it could lead something it had forgotten, and had also discovered that it could wage war without shooting, which was a very important thing to do. So the United States stood back, did not engage, supported the Ukrainians, and made it impossible for the Russians to convert rubles to dollars at the Federal Reserve Bank. And that was the discovery of a new sort of power, which was always there, but we didn't know. So where we are now is a very important place. We've entered a new era. But we can see that we've entered that era only by looking backwards. In looking backwards, we see this is different from 1945. Looking backwards, we can see this is different from 1991. And therefore, by looking backwards, we can see what's new. If you can't look backwards, you can't imagine what's new. And what are the things that the Americans are learning in this? Well, the most important question that the Americans are learning in this is the centrality of space. If we want to know what the Russians are doing, they can't hide it. From space, we can see them. We always knew this, but this is a war in which we could operationalize it. And if the Russians could, they would destroy our satellites, which they always claimed to be able to do, but they couldn't. And so where does war go now? Well, war went with the iPhone into tactical operations on the face of the earth. Now we are in a different time, where the real issue is not what happens on the face of the earth, but happens in space. From space, we can see the ground. And on the ground, we can see soldiers. And the soldiers we have seen, we can order to be killed by weapons in space or weapons on the ground or what have you. So the geopolitical shift that we see coming out of this, one that will last forever, is that we have now entered space warfare. We've been there really for a long time, being able to spot Soviet satellites or Chinese satellites, they're being able to spot ours. But now space is bound up with warfare on the ground, and therefore the enemy we have, whoever it is, must destroy our capabilities in space. To command the earth, you must command space. To command the sea, you must command space. We talk about artificial intelligence, and I'm not sure what that is. I assume that's very good. But from a geopolitical point of view, we think well enough. We don't need help. What we need is space-based systems. And the important thing about space-based systems, and I once met your Minister of Space, a very pleasant meeting, and you went to Mars, perhaps not on your own technology, but you went. A small nation can become a force in space because it doesn't require 100,000 men in uniform, but maybe 200 to take the technologies that already exist and create something from it. So when we talk about technology in war, in general. It comes from war. We can go back to steamships. We can go back to many things. But war creates technology because when you go to war, one, you spend money, and two, it's life and death. And so you get results. We're in a new period. We have seen the decline of Russia, and we are seeing the decline of China. Yes, you will laugh at that idea, but you would have laughed when I said Russia was finished. China is now in its economic end, its final crisis. When the United States began to be an economic power in 1890, it began by selling low-cost, cheap products to the world. By the year 2000, the United States sold 1/2 of all manufactured products in the world. By 1930, it collapsed economically, 40 years later, the Great Depression. It recovered. Japan, in 1950, began its role as a cheap producer. It became an enormous economic power, and by 1990, 40 years later, it collapsed. The Chinese economic boom really ran for 40 years. And now we see the Chinese economy staggering, unable to pay its debts. It's 35% of its economy is real estate, and the largest real estate companies are defaulting on their debts. We will all think this doesn't mean anything. When the United States went into its crisis, we thought, it doesn't mean anything. They'll be better in a week. When Japan went into its crisis, we all thought, well, they'll be better in a week. But they won't be. They will not collapse. They're a great power. They will come out of it, but not in less than 10 years, as the other said. And therefore, what we have to look at there is that China is weakened and weakening, whatever it says. Russia is weakened and weakening, and the United States is emerging, but that cannot be the only power. So I will name 3 powers to you that I expect to rise, and some of them you will laugh at, because I'm always laughed at. That's fine. One is Japan, the world's 3rd largest economy, a significant military, and a united population. Number 2, Poland. We are already seeing Poland emerge in Europe in this war as the decisive power, as the leader. And Turkey, which was in a terrible economic crisis and is emerging, but is a pivot.